The first sentence of this passage, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with people, honestly hit me like a freight train. This was one of the lines I highlighted in my personal book, and I think it stuck with me because it made me stop and look at everything Quinn had been saying a little differently. Because if there's nothing fundamentally wrong with people, then maybe humans aren't just naturally greedy or destructive. Maybe we're not doomed to destroy everything we touch. Maybe a lot of what we do comes from the story that we've been given about what it means to be human. And then Quinn says, given a story to enact. The word enact is really important to me. He's not saying that we're just told a story and we believe it. He's saying that we actually live it. We make decisions based on it. We build our lives around it. Eventually, we can be so used to the story that we don't even realize we're following one. And I think that's exactly what Quinn is getting at with the Takers. The Taker story tells us that humans are separate from the rest of the world. We're above it. We're supposed to control it, use it, and eventually conquer it. So when Quinn says that people who are given a story where they're the lords of the world will act like the lords of the world, I think he's explaining why so much of what humans do seems completely normal to us. Most people are waking up every day thinking, how can I hurt the planet today? We're just doing things that we've been taught are normal. We're taught that having more is better, more money, more things, more land, more production, more convenience. And we take from the earth because we've been taught that those resources are there for us. Some people even hunt just for fun. And we don't necessarily stop and question the story underneath those choices. We just think that's the way that things are. And that's where I think the takers and the leaver distinction becomes really important. The Leavers have a completely different understanding of their place in the world. They don't see themselves as above everything else. They see themselves as part of the community. They take what they need without treating the world like an unlimited supply made specifically for them. So it's not just that the takers and the leavers behave differently, they've been given completely different stories about what the world actually is. If I believe that the world belongs to me, then taking from it feels right. And if I believe that I belong to the world, then taking from it becomes something that I have to consciously think about before making the next decision. And that's where Quinn's argument starts to have real philosophical weight on me. Because the story just doesn't tell us what to do. It shapes what we think is normal, what we think is valuable, and what we think we're entitled to. But this is also where I start to question Quinn a little bit. I agree that our stories shape us, and I think he's right that culture can make certain behaviors feel so normal that we don't even notice the assumptions behind them. But I don't think the story completely determines us, because if it did, how could anyone ever change? If the Taker story has been passed down for generations, what makes it possible for someone to step outside of it and say, wait, maybe this isn't the only way to live? And I think the narrator does give us an answer. He was raised inside the same culture. He had been given the same basic story about humanity's place in the world, but Ishmael gave him another way to look at it. And he started questioning things he'd previously accepted as obvious. So maybe we're shaped by the stories we're given, but we're not completely trapped by them. We can learn a story, we can question it, and that's where this becomes an ethical issue for me. I don't think we're responsible for choosing the story that we're born into. If you've been taught your entire life that humans are supposed to dominate nature, you might genuinely believe you're doing what you're supposed to. Culture can explain a lot of why people behave the way they do, but culture can explain our behavior without completely excusing it. You feel me? Once we recognize the story we're living by, I think our responsibility then shifts. We can question it, we can decide whether we still believe it, and if we recognize that the story is causing harm, then continuing to enact in it becomes a choice that's harder to excuse. That's the space that exists between being shaped by our culture and being responsible for our actions. That's why the second half of Quinn's passage is so genuinely powerful. If he says that we're given a story where the world is a foe to be conquered, then we'll conquer it like a foe until eventually their foe will lie bleeding to death at their feet. That's a really brutal image, which I'm sure the author did intentionally. If you believe something is your enemy, you never ask how to live alongside it. You ask how to defeat it. And if we've been taught to see nature as something standing in the way of human progress, then destroying it doesn't necessarily feel like destruction, it feels like winning. That's why I think this passage is bigger than just an argument about the environment. It's about what happens when a story becomes so normal that we stop questioning whether it should be the story we're living at all. And honestly, that's what this book did to me. I started Ishmael thinking I was reading a book about a gorilla. And by the end of it, I realized I was being asked to question assumptions I didn't even realize that I had. One of the ideas that really stayed with me was the idea that other animals don't hoard resources. They live with the elements, they take what they need. And I don't think that means humans can just copy animals and suddenly they've solved everything. But it did make me question why taking more has become so connected to our idea of success. Why is more automatically better? Why is enough so hard for us to define in every aspect of our life? Who taught us that it had to be that way? Those questions bring me right back to Quinn's passage. If people really do live according to the stories they're given, then what story are we enacting when we believe more is always better? What story are we enacting when we believe the world exists to provide for us? And what responsibility do we have once we realize that story is hurting the world? And then at the end of the book, we're left with Gorilla gone, will there be hope for man? Ishmael can teach the narrator how to question the story, but he can't live that story for him. The narrator has to decide what to do with what he's learned. And I think that's where the responsibility eventually reaches us as readers. I don't think I'm responsible for the story I was handed, as I said, but once I recognize that there is a story, I have to decide what I'm going to do with that knowledge. And that's actually why I want other people to read Ishmael. Not because I think everyone needs to come away with the exact same answer that I did, but because I think questioning itself matters. Ishmael taught one person to question the story that he'd been given. Maybe that person teaches another 100. Maybe those 100 teach another 100. I know that's probably a little idealistic. I don't think one book is going to magically change the world. I don't know if individual people changing the way that they think is enough to undo a system that has existed for generations. But I do think that's what it means to become a teacher in your own way. You don't have to have all the answers. Maybe you just have to be willing to question the story you've been handed and give someone else the opportunity to question theirs. Because if Quinn is right, stories are powerful. And if a story can teach us to see the world as something to conquer, then maybe a different story can teach us that we belong to the world instead. So I think Quinn is right that people tend to live according to their stories that their cultures give them. Where I struggle is what happens after we recognize the story. I don't know if awareness is actually enough to create change. I don't know if individual choices can overcome a culture built around a completely different worldview. And I don't know what the perfect placement story would even look like. But maybe I don't have to know yet. Maybe the responsibility starts before having that answer. Maybe it starts with being willing to question the story at all. Because if there's really nothing fundamentally wrong with people, then maybe our future isn't completely determined by the story we inherited. Maybe the question is whether once we finally recognize the story we're enacting, we're willing to choose a different one and we are willing to teach it to 100 more.